Hey everybody, welcome back to Poquito Podcast. I'm Dominic Angel.
And I'm Rian Reyes.
Before we get into today's episode, we want to remind you that we have a live show coming up on June 15th in Inglewood that's going to be hosted by us, the Poquito Boys, along with previous guest Sylvia Deanda. It's going to be a emotional release experience, a safe space for us to all cry and laugh and sing together. There's going to be a sad footage compilation. There's going to be live stand-up by me and Sylvia and plenty of others. We're going to have a sad art market, and we're going to finish off the night with karaoke, all sad songs, hosted by Jerry from Live at Jerry's. It's going to be a fun night. All the info's in the event description. Hope to see you there.
Also, be sure to like, subscribe, follow us, leave a comment, rate and review us, and check out our public Discord. It's free to join, and there's a lot of cool stuff up there. Enjoy the episode. Poquito Podcast. Poquito
Podcast. Welcome back to the podcast, everybody. I'm Dominic Angel. With me is my brother Rian Reyes. Very excited to be here. We have an incredible guest today, one of our favorites. It's been over a year since we last saw each other. Please, everybody, welcome back Dani to the podcast.
Hello.
We wanted to have you on last month. Obviously, we had scheduling issues, but we wanted to have like a follow-up round too, because I feel like just based off of like following you, like your social media, a lot of stuff has developed since we last spoke.
Yeah.
And like your journey has been has brought a lot of new information. Mm-hmm. Well, here's the thing is that Ryan had some big plans for Autism Awareness Month, and I feel like you didn't really get out what you wanted to from the month, right?
Yeah, there was just like so much going on that was hard to contemplate all of it, like once we got down to it. And then it was a thing where like there was so much that I wanted to talk about, and then when we actually started getting into it, honestly, we just kept distracting ourselves. So we didn't get as much of it as I wanted to. Like I remember, I don't know if he wants to talk about it, but we had like a really good conversation after the podcast about Josh and his family.
You know, here's the thing is I've been taking a lot of time off because I have had stuff going on personally. Yeah, I know. I fell last night. I felt so bad. We'll talk about it in the Patreon, but I slipped at work and I almost called out today, but I was like, dude, I've used up all my sick days. Josh made that joke earlier. But I was like, I got to be in here. And I feel like the thing is somebody's got to be the dad around here. And you guys get distracted. You guys like to play around.
You are kind of dressed like a 90s dad right now.
The 90s is back, dude. But anyway, we're back. We're here. I'm excited. Let's get into it.
Yeah, I'm excited. That actually brings up a thing we were talking about before we hit record. I forgot what you called it, though. But there's this thing that I do a lot sometimes where I ignore being injured to, like, finish something that I, like a goal or task that I'm doing.
Okay, so I was bringing up how autistic people are known for, or like some autistic people have interoception issues where it's like you don't really know what's going on with your body. So I was saying like in part I think that it's like we don't realize like how injured we are at first. But then I also think that what you're saying now, it's giving me the term hyperfocus, where you're just like so focused on what you're doing.
Yeah, like I was telling them a story about one time I was taking an exam, and this was like my junior year. It was a class that I was trying to pass so I didn't have to go to summer school. So I'm trying to focus, and I have a coordination issue with my hands because I'm right-handed, but I'm blind in my right eye. So I have to really focus when I'm writing so that I can write neat and legibly. I don't know if that was a word.
Yes.
Mm-hmm. And I was so focused and I was writing so quickly that I was putting a lot of pressure on my index finger, and it slipped and slammed down, and I dislocated the finger. And at first I didn't realize what was happening. I was like, it did that, and I was like, ow, that hurt. And then I tried to pick up the pencil and my hand wouldn't close. So I hold it up and I go like this, and my index finger goes like that. And it stiffens. And I was like, oh, I think I just dislocated my finger. And then just very short but peculiar pattern of thought happened where the first thing I remembered is, well, dislocating is a bad thing. Every time I've ever heard an athlete dislocate something, that's like weeks of rest. They have to go to the doctor. I should ask to go to the nurse. And then this image from this Disney movie popped in my head of a kid dislocating his shoulder and the coach being like, no, we'll just pop it back in. I was like, oh, you can pop it back in. So I just fiddled with it a bit, and then there was a loud and then I went, ow. And then my hand could bend again, and I was like, okay, I guess I'm finishing my essay.
Did that disrupt the class?
No, nobody knew that this was happening. It was very quiet. Literally the only thing anyone would have heard was in the distance you heard
That sounds like when, people choke to death because they're too embarrassed to admit that they're choking.
I just remember someone doing a physical bit where oh, it was Tim Robbins.
Yeah. That's a thing. People get embarrassed by choking, so then they excuse themselves to the bathroom and they don't have anyone to help them, and then they die.
I was always worried about that happening, being alone and having to remove something. So I learned how to do a reverse Heimlich. You just slam yourself against a wall. It sounds ridiculous and it hurts, but I had to use it once, and that's how it was funny that I learned to do that because I actually needed to do it at one point.
The amount of times you have an innocent story that is followed up by some of the most deranged things I've ever heard in my life.
And or terrifying.
You were talking about forgetting stuff when you lose the house. On 3 separate occasions, I forgot that I was making tea, and I almost burnt my kitchen down. I think it's safe to say I have ADHD.
It's unsafe for everybody else.
I just had a conversation with someone like this. They had been not acknowledging how disabling their ADHD is, and then they had an incident which also impacted the safety for other people, and they were like, okay, I really need to get this under control.
Yeah, that's the thing that's been on my mind a lot lately is I feel like because it's been so long since it was at the forefront of what people talked about, ADHD has been kind of subtly dismissed in the back of people's heads.
Yeah, can I ask you guys about that? Because you all so one of the things that's happened since last year was, I told you that Ryan ran me through the DSM-5. And I'm oh, I probably have ADHD. I probably am autistic. But it's been a thing for me, learning about it and how it affects me over the year. But you guys are deep in it, and do a lot of research and are well versed in things. How do you feel about the whole culture around everybody relating to being ADHD or autistic, on TikTok, and then the criticism that's come after that, where it's become kind of a meme to make fun of people, everybody has ADHD?
It's a thing that's always kind of in the back of my head when new things come up. I'm always appreciative when something from the community brings us together, or is we're able to connect. But I'm always aware of how people outside the community interpret everything. An autistic person came up with the meme term TISM, and it was just supposed to be a fun slang that we could use. But as soon as I heard it, I was I even think I said this last year. I was somebody's gonna use that the wrong way. And then now, whenever someone's too cringy, they're I think he has a touch of the TISM, or they say that when they're trying to imply that someone's stupid, which takes it back to being compared to retardation. And it's for some people, they haven't. It's one of those things where because it's not directly affecting them, they don't care enough to learn.
Mm-hmm.
Right.
Yeah, I mean, that's a big thing with linguistics in general. I really love language. Mm-hmm. So what I know is the R word and the word dumb, the word idiot, those all come from, at a time, they were considered neutral terms to describe people with intellectual disabilities or other types of disabilities. And then it became that somebody took it and they made it a mean thing.
Yeah.
So it's that's what's happening now is people saying TISM for each other and for themselves is now turning into people are making it a bad thing because that's how they perceive autistic people.
Yeah, and I think it's more noticeable because it's, it's more because of the internet. Like it's fast, things progress faster because there's more connection to the information about it.
Right.
Like when people's comments started getting flagged because they were saying autistic, they started saying acoustic as a workaround, and then immediately that became a thing.
Yep.
Right.
Lately, I've been seeing a lot of stuff. For me, the last 2 years, I want to say, I started focusing a lot more on my ADHD because, sorry, my phone is honking. I forget that the text tone is a clown honk, and it distracts me. It was all based on an offhand joke. Someone texted me, and I didn't keep their number, so I was like, who's this clown? And then... and I thought it was funny, but now it's a thing. Where was I? Oh, ADHD.
Oh, right. I forget everything.
It's because I always felt the same way. When I was a kid, I do remember ADHD being taken a lot more seriously. For a while, it was, I think, the number one diagnosis before dyslexia. And then people found out about dyslexia, and that changed things. And that's not to say, like, that it was, like, I don't know. I feel like I put a weird connotation on it by phrasing it that. But I mean that it was severe, so people were learning about it, and you were seeing it in, like, after school specials. You were seeing it, like, in sitcoms. When a kid had ADHD, it was, like, a whole episode about finding out that this kid had a learning disability. And then by the time I was in high school, people were used to it. People use that terminology for, like, hyperactive, distractible children. And so that, coupled with people being misdiagnosed and it turning out to just be like a dietary thing for some kids, people stopped taking it seriously. And then I never thought of it that way when I was diagnosed. So I never fully acknowledged, like you were saying with the person you talked to, how much it actually affects my day to day.
Right.
It was honestly not until, like, I was 20 and had to start functioning on my own that it really started to, like, get in the way. Like, I remember if I was too distracted on the bus, I'd miss my bus, and then I'd end up in a different city. I had to get picked up, like, 3 times. It sounds funny, but it was dangerous. Like the thing with the tea. I made that joke, but it actually happened. Like, I almost started a fire. And and then the more I learned about ADHD, the more I realized, like, how much of it's a part of, like, connections with my anxiety and with my obsessive compulsive disorder.
Yeah, that's been interesting to see, because there's a thing where how do I put this? I think culture affects a lot of, like, how we interpret diagnoses and how the reasons why a lot of people relate to symptoms of ADHD, autism, or other neurodivergent conditions. Like things like attention span and stuff are like, we're on our screens all the time, so we're getting these, like, dopamine hits, and so that affects people's concentration, like ability to concentrate, or that affects things like we're on social media all the time, everybody's in front of a screen all the time, or stuff like diet, like our food is less nutritious, and, like, it affects other things like how we think, how we function, and I think that's why a lot of people relate to symptoms of ADHD. Does that make sense? Is that real, or
Yeah, it's something I talk about a lot because people have a misunderstanding about what the divergence is. Because these are phenomena that do happen, like, in my opinion, in a way for everyone, but with people that have these disorders, it's not once in a while. Or with non-autistic, non-ADHD people, something led to that. You know what I mean? Like short attention spans are a thing that younger generations developed because of the access, whereas people with ADHD, they don't develop it. That's just how their brain works. Mm-hmm. And so it's it's a silly comparison because it's not like I'm not trying to say it's like a superpower or anything, but it's like someone who can naturally sing versus someone who is trained to sing. Mm-hmm. There is a difference, and not only, even if it comes to like the same conclusion, there's still a physical difference. And it's also with a lot of people, when it's a disorder, it's to an extreme that non-autistic, non-divergent people have to deal with. For instance, because of my OCD, I have an unwanted thoughts disorder. And a lot of people don't understand what that is. And it's actually a thing that I've been talking about a lot lately. And sometimes I feel a little naggy about it. But when people use the term intrusive thought, it gets annoying for me. Mm-hmm. Because they think that it's impulsive, inappropriate thoughts or actions. And it's like, no, those are just impulsive thoughts. Those are just impulses. An intrusive thought is an idea or image that's invading your normal functioning. Like, I tell that joke about locking the door, but it's because in my head, I'm actually visualizing and like my muscle memory is kicking in and I am feeling what it would be like to fall out of the car and immediately get run over. And that anxiety of that image and feeling drives me to react. So I lock my door and I hold on to the handle. Mm-hmm. I'm not crying. I was talking too fast and ran out of air. And it's a thing where people don't realize how actually invading and disruptive intrusive thoughts are because they don't know what they are. Mm-hmm. It's like because you can have intrusive thoughts without having OCD or ADHD, but they're usually connected to trauma, and that's why it's intruding. It's a thing you don't want to be thinking about. It's a thing you don't want to happen. Versus these impulses, these are things that even if they're inappropriate, the person thinking or wanting to do it still wants to do it, and that's the distinction. Mm-hmm. It's want versus unwant.
Right. Yeah. Okay. I get it. Sorry, I was thinking of a different question. But Dani, do you have what's been your experience with you talk a lot about different is it condition or is it?
I say brain labels. I say conditions.
Okay.
I say that I have a neuro-complex. I am neuro-complex. I wouldn't say I'm neurodivergent.
Okay.
But I say complex because I have multiple what I call brain labels, and they're diagnoses, but they're also just labels. They don't necessarily have to be seen in the medicalized framework. That is how they came to us. That's how they've been packaged and handed to us. But I don't think that it's necessary so what it's called is the psychopathological lens. It's psychopathologizing how other people are experiencing the world. Mm-hmm. And the neurodiversity framework is acknowledging that within every population, there are going to be a variety of brain types. So from my perspective, there is no normal, but I've also learned to just leave that alone. But I feel the same way that you do about intrusive thoughts. I feel that way about neurodivergent, but I'm just I understand what they're saying. This is not the time for this conversation. Let's just keep moving. It's hard for me though. It took me a year of saying it for me to be just don't say it. Just leave it alone. Another time.
Yeah, that's what I'm experiencing right now with intrusive. Yeah.
But if I can get, sorry to interrupt, but my understanding of what you guys are saying, right, is that the reason why it is important to you guys and it affects you is because, for other people that are mislabeling things or misunderstanding things, it takes away from. It takes away people don't take it serious. People stop taking interest. It dilutes it, right? Yeah. Or when they mischaracterize something because when the thing that it actually is gets taken less seriously because it's just broad, right?
Yeah, the more generalized the idea becomes, the less people focus on it and the less people care about it. And for me, that seriously, severely happened to the concept of ADHD over the last 2 decades, where ADHD got replaced by dyslexia, got replaced by autism, and so people just forget that those things exist and that they're impactful. I also just wanted to comment on what you're saying, because I'm trying to remember the new terms, because it's a combination of what's actually being updated worldwide and what's also being pushed by like individuals. So it's sometimes hard for me to remember which ones like I kind of agree with. So I usually just fall back on terms, but I also explain, like when I say divergence, I explain like this is just what's the difference between my thought type and your thought type. Like this is a high diverge from the way you think.
What do you guys think about the movie Divergent?
Haven't seen it.
I thought it was funny. When, especially like this far into like interacting with the community, I feel like it was kind of like, I don't know how to say this in a nicer way. It was like emotional porn. Like it was one of those movies that turns it into a superpower.
Right. Literally.
Yeah, literally, because it was a thing where like she was so hyper focused. So I don't know if you know the story, the whole story, but the first movie is dealing with these people that are categorized into brain types, and the way they test them is there's a machine that puts them in a dream state. It's a designed dream. Someone is writing the dream, and it's a test of how they handle fear. And these divergent people would become so hyper focused with the task at hand that they would ignore the fear in order to solve the problem.
Right.
So that's why I thought it was funny. It's like they're so hyper focused that they're ignoring like drowning or being attacked by crows to get through the test.
And in that context, it makes it like a superpower.
Yeah.
I see what you're saying.
Yeah, it's a weird. I always think of like at the time I didn't relate it to like autism or like being neurodivergent, but like now having all the information today, it's like looking. It does feel like somebody that doesn't. I don't know the author or the director or like the storyteller's history about it, but it does feel like something that's like somebody that heard about a thing and then is going to try to romanticize it.
Yeah, and I do get where that comes from. I do think people are just trying to feel comfortable with it, not only with like people outside this community, but also people in the community. Like older people diagnosed with autism definitely hold on to like Asperger's. They hold on to high functioning, and they call it superpower because they don't like remembering what it's being compared to. Like even a guy, there's this guy I follow who's 4 years older than me, and he still is like, you can hear the panic in his voice when he talks about it. He admitted that he had autism, but the more he talked about it in the video, the more anxious his voice got because he wanted to make sure people didn't look down on him. And that's the thing I experience. I don't talk about it I talk about it a lot more lately, but the first year I was diagnosed, I didn't like it. I was trying to prove that I wasn't autistic.
I gotta tell you, I've felt the same way this whole year. I've just been like,
no.
It's not. It's like I've had like a visceral reaction to things because it's like when I understood, when I accepted it, like when I fully related to like the diagnosis, which I still haven't done like a professional diagnosis, but there's just like the more research that I do and the more that I like information that I get from like your channel and other people's channels that I follow, I'm like, oh, like this is a thing that I've always been affected by. And so like I finally understood and I'm like, okay, cool. I have this thing, but I'm fine. Like I can handle this. And then it became a thing that like as I started to see it pop up more and more on social media, I would be like, oh, get over it. Like what is like you could still be normal. Like you don't have to make it your personality, like blah blah blah, like. And so I do relate to that, where it's like not that I don't like it for myself, but I'm just like, the whole get over it thing.
Yeah.
And now I'm like coming around to just being cool about it. I'm chill, guys.
It has made me think a lot about stuff that I come to realize people invented. This wasn't ever officially tied, like the term on the spectrum. At least that I can find, doctors didn't come up with that phrase. People did.
Right.
And the reason I came to that conclusion is because the more they thought about it, the more I actually understood. And it was because I learned more about the spectrum and how it's used so that I could explain to people why they were wrong about it. But the more I thought about it, like, nobody's on the spectrum. That's not how the spectrum works. The spectrum is a category of symptoms associated with autism. So if you have the disorder, then they gauge where you are with each category of the disorder. But the idea of being on the spectrum itself is made up because it's a tool. It's like I compare it a lot lately to like the statistics on baseball cards. It's just them keeping track of where you are in each category. But I do think something that I think is helpful now, especially for people trying to transition with new knowledge, is the level system. It's separate from the spectrum, and it's about gauging support needs. So there's levels 1 through 3.
Before we get into that, because I do want to hear about this, before we get too far in, I just wanted to hear like if Dani had any thoughts about, like, did you have the experience of just like not liking your diagnosis or like being like trying to like fight it?
I had a very different experience because I was 17 when I figured it out. And like, I always knew I was different. Like, if you ask an autistic person who's gone through what I call autistic self-acceptance, like, we're so focused on autistic acceptance in the world, but there's also like a layer of like, you need to learn to accept yourself and the way that this impacts you. And like you said, like, you don't necessarily have to talk about it all the time. You don't have to make it the forefront of your mind, but just accepting it is a very big difference in the way that you then move about your life and the way you feel about yourself, and therefore learning how to accommodate yourself, which is going to improve your life.
Right.
Yeah. You said something else, though. I don't think I answered the question. I think I segued.
No, I mean, that's...
I didn't hate it because I knew I was when I was 17, I learned about it in class and I was like, this is me. And I told my mom and she was like, no, it's not. And then I was just like, okay. So for the next 10 years, I consumed media about autistic people.
Right.
And I found out like autistic people like noise canceling headphones and some people like weighted blankets. And so I was like, I'm just going to stock up on these things because I think that they'll be good for me too. Like, maybe I'm not, but maybe I'll enjoy these supports. And I did. And then 2020 came around and a lot of people had the journey of being like, I am by myself all the time. I am acting as my natural self, and my natural self does things like stimming, like echolalia, which is really just another form of stimming by repeating words over and over. And so many people had this realization of they're autistic.
Yeah.
And all of us autistic people are home alone, not socializing, and are like, hey, I just figured this out. Maybe other people need to figure this out, going on social media. And then it's kind of like a domino effect. Like, more people got more information.
Yeah.
But so, yeah, I never hated it. I was always like, finally, like, yes.
I do think that that's an interesting, like, understanding of the perspectives, because that's something that I also had to think about, because people ask me all the time about how I came to the diagnosis, and I feel like it's a difference of realization. Like, on when you come to the conclusion yourself, you're identifying with other people. So it immediately creates a sense of community, because you realize that this thing that's been in the back of your head, other people feel it too. Other people are going through it too.
Right.
And that's more reassuring versus when you're officially diagnosed by a doctor. That's somebody telling you that you're different from everyone else.
Right.
That's someone telling you you're alone.
Right.
And I think that that's why so many people, even if they're progressing on their own journey, I think that's why a lot of older autistic people are kind of hesitant about self-diagnosis in the community. Because they're like, this is my opinion and my theory about it. I think emotionally they're like, well, I had to overcome that feeling and you just get to feel good about it. That's not fair, kind of a thing.
Yeah. I think so. What you said was really big about the whole self-acceptance thing, because that was, I think, the hardest part. Because at first I identified with it. It was like cycles of like identifying with it, but then like thinking that it changed me, and then like not wanting to change. But like, you brought up the self-acceptance and about how you can learn to accommodate yourself. I lit up when you said that, because Ryan and I had this exact conversation, because I was the first like 4 to 6 months of like after me like connecting with the diagnoses was really tough on me. Like I went through a depression for a while because I was just like, it's like a whole, having that acceptance at 32 or 31, whatever. Yeah, 31 in my 30s was like looking back at a whole lifetime of like, this is what was going on, and like, this is how things could have been different had I known, and all this other stuff. And also like there was a big thing with me and Ryan where I was like super angry with him because he's really good at advocating for himself and like really good at like communicating accommodations. And I had a conversation with him where I was upset. I was yelling. And I was like, what about me? Like, I've had to figure it out this whole time. And I'm like, you need accommodations, but, you know, stuff still has to get done. And I've had to do it this whole time. And then Ryan, you know, Ryan was a saint because he took it all in, like, very gracefully and was just like, listen, man, you got to accommodate yourself. Like, you don't have to be feeling this way. And then that was like a big like moment for me, like a big epiphany where I was like, oh, fuck, now I get it.
Did you have the moment where you realized you were allowed to accommodate for yourself?
Yeah. That was the thing. It was just like, oh, like I definitely, had that realization of like, it was like, I always compare it to like, you know, those toys that are held together by string. And like that's how I was wound up this whole time of like I was like just holding it together like by sheer tension, and then that moment just like released the tension, and then I realized how like stressed I've been for years and how like that's where my anxiety was coming from. And then it was like, oh, okay, I can start figuring out what I need, what my accommodations are, and start communicating those. There's still a part of me, to be honest, that I'm like, I'm still in a mode of like, well, stuff still has to get done.
Right.
And so like sometimes I'm aware of I might need accommodations, but I think that's like the awareness makes it easier because I'm like, you just gotta buckle down. Like at least I'm aware of like the things that I need that I'm foregoing.
Yeah.
It's a choice, I guess.
Yeah, I think that's a huge thing because I think we also talked about this about especially if it's ADHD is involved. There's this thing about understanding and acknowledging burnout that changes how aware you are of your physical body. Mm-hmm. And it makes it harder to jump back into that like work ethic. Because so many undiagnosed ADHD people do this thing where it's like all or none. They spend all of their energy all at once and they don't realize that they're burnt out. And then when it's pointed out and they have to acknowledge it, all of a sudden they feel how much their head hurts. They feel how much their eyes are tired. And they feel the anxious like shivering that they didn't notice before. Like this is a thing, I think we used to talk about it. This is what started me thinking that you were like me, was when we worked together, sometimes you'd be talking and your hands would shake. And you didn't realize you were doing it. And I think I tried to point it out once and you had no idea what I was talking about.
I still don't.
Yeah.
I was not aware of that.
And it's a funny, that's another funny concept because it's similar. I feel like it's similar to just like dealing with mental wellness and therapy in general, where like once you've gone through it, you immediately see it in other people and you don't know how to explain it to them because it's their journey. They have to come to the conclusion on their own, or otherwise it won't get better for them. And it's funny, like, especially finding out so many of our family members might be autistic also. Mm-hmm. I immediately like recognize their twitches now. Like when my mom's anxious, her mouth, she gets dry mouth, and I was like, Mom, did you have water today? Yeah, immediately, like I'll start hearing. I'm like, Mom, you need to drink water today. You're anxious. I don't think you've eaten. And it's like checking and remembering to like self-maintain, right. Which I struggle with too. Like I never think I try to, you know, because I always come off like I'm babysitting people, and it's like, no, I recognize it myself, and that's why, you know, I know that I have to push myself to do that, so that incentivizes me to also do that for other people. Like not parent, just remind them like, hey, if you want to take a break, you can.
Right.
Yeah.
Going back to the like learning about it, that I was definitely emotional. I did what I consider grieving, like with before knowing, and being really angry at adults and like, why didn't they realize this? Because for me, the first real, like looking back, the first real signal of it that should have been like a big sign, parents go figure this out, was I did an interview to attend a preschool or kindergarten, and they said, yeah, she's great at everything, but her social skills are terrible. And my mom was like, but I socialize her, like, what's the problem? And they were like, I don't know. So now we know what it was, but we didn't have the information at the time. So I'm just like 27 and processing all of that, like 5-year-old me, all of these ages. Like my mom did like basically at home ABA and like had me textures, and I was very uncomfortable with that. And there's a lot of repercussions that come with that. So I was very angry and depressed. And that is what you're saying. Like people have to come to their own conclusions, because I don't want to push somebody down a path that's so emotional and like completely rocks, at least it rocked my world entirely.
Yeah, that whole, I forget about that term, but that like, you use the term grieving, because it is a jarring thing of like realizing it. The way I interpret how it felt for me was like you are realizing that how you were didn't have to be who you were, if that makes sense.
The way,
or like flip that. Who you were didn't have to be who you were. Like this.
You said the exact thing.
I know. I said how the first time and I meant who. A thing like realizing that you were pretending to be someone for everyone else, and that's why you were always like unhappy
and confused.
Yeah, like I remember. I think what was a lot of people in my family have been getting diagnosed lately. I was the only one while we were growing up that had an official diagnosis. And so even though there are these people that think like I do and they went through similar stuff I did, their experience was to hide it, so they can't identify it in me. And so instead of bringing us closer in a lot of circumstances, it was the thing that like divided us. Like I talked to old family, and I don't think we've ever had to actually have a hard conversation about it, but they'll be like, yeah, you guys used to come over all the time. It's like, yeah, but now that we're adults, like I remember what that was like, and I didn't like it. You know, I remember being invited everywhere because we're family, but I remember also being talked to differently because people didn't know how to talk to me, especially even after diagnosis, because no one knew that they were also like that. It became a thing where instead of learning more, they were just safer around me, and they kind of like handled me with kid gloves. And it wasn't until I was an adult, honestly, it wasn't until like TikTok for a lot of family where they could figure out that they also did that thing.
And on their own terms, in their own space, privately, where they don't have to have the conversation or worry about being perceived. Because if you tell someone, I think that you do this like me, then they have to like grapple with that emotion and present themselves. And for some people, it comes off as like self-defensively, no, I'm not. And I have had that reaction for sure. And that was really hard. I was going to say something else, but I can't remember what it was.
I don't know if this is the term. It's not the term scapegoat, but do you feel like you've been like you're the catalyst for other people? Like you had to be the one to go through it for other people to realize?
The giraffe died.
I'm so sorry.
No, you're fine.
I was just going to try to ignore it.
We all were. That's why I had to say something. That's always funny. Something that like happens because that's like, I'm going off topic. But it's like that's the thing in my head. Was like I know when everyone's thinking the same thing, and I was like, no, we can acknowledge it because it's not a big deal.
I really love that. I feel like that is it's such an intentional choice, and it's a way to acknowledge something that everybody is experiencing at the same time, but like either nobody has words or nobody thinks that you're allowed to like socially appropriateness.
For the audio listeners, there's a balloon on the table and it fell.
And we all paused.
We all just let the room breathe for a second. Everybody was weighing whether or not to bring it up. And Ryan took the bullet for us.
Yes.
But that's a thing. That's so funny. That's always a thing for me where like I'll be listening to another podcast and somebody will say something, or they'll say something in a funny way, or like, and then people just move on in the conversation. And for like 10 minutes, I'm like, are they going to talk about that? There's that side of me that's like, why aren't they talking about this?
Can't keep paying attention. Yeah, I'm the same way.
Yeah. What were we talking about? We were talking about family. Going back to that a little bit, it's definitely been a not funny, but like an interesting experience for me now that people are starting to realize it. Because there's also, like, I have family members who have friends or like significant others who their siblings and children are starting to show signs. And they'll always say the same thing, and I don't. It's like I have this urge to jump on it, but I know that it's not going to work either way, so I just listen to them. But they'll be describing like the thing the kid's doing, and they're like, I mean, like I do that sometimes, but it's not as bad. And I immediately want to be like, well, what about when you were younger? Was it worse? Like, maybe that's because you're trying to hide it, you know. And it's just funny because I don't try to trick them or manipulate them, but sometimes I'll show them something I found out about, and then like there's this, we talked about it in April. There was this video going around about a question that's on the current assessment for autism. The question is, how are 2 and 7 similar? And I asked a couple of people this question, and I knew they would be uncomfortable I knew that it made them uncomfortable to tell them that it was from the autism assessment. So I was like, well, it's more of a personality gauge. It's about the thought process.
Can I tell you something before you reveal the answer? As I was listening to the episode when you asked that question, and I was like, oh, they're both slanted. Like immediately, as I was listening to it, I was like, they're both slanted. They both look the same.
And it was funny. I can't say that this is how everyone thought with autism, but it was funny, like explaining to people why I thought this. And a lot of people identified with it when we talk about it, where it was like, I think the reason it's part of the assessment is because if you don't have autism, it's a common sense thing. The first thing that pops in is they're both numbers. But what I think is happening with some autistic people is they are recognizing that that's already a pretense. So they think there's deeper meanings to the question. So they overthink the question and they start looking for similarities. So a lot of people say like they're both slanted, or they say, I don't know, they don't look the same.
I say that they're both prime numbers. When you said they're both numbers, I was like, oh my gosh, you could just say that. And so like you described my brain right now.
That's the, but it's so weird to just be like, they're both numbers.
It's implied.
Duh.
Exactly.
That's like saying, what does a dog and the number 2 have in common?
Roll.
They're both 3 letters.
Wow.
Wait, hold on. Why did you say that? It's not like that.
Well, that's what I'm saying. I'm like, it's like obviously, like if you're gonna compare two things.
What's the obvious?
That's why I don't.
So glad someone laughed. I tell that joke every time.
What's the obvious comparison between the dog and the number 2?
No. I'm saying that it's not an obvious comparison. I'm saying the opposite. I'm saying to present saying
you can pick
that
any two things.
You can pick any two things if you were gonna just say like, oh, they're both numbers.
No, because a dog and the number 2 aren't both numbers.
No.
Like,
they know what I'm saying. Okay, the neurodivergent people out there know what I'm talking about. Josh doesn't get it.
Yeah, I don't get it.
Poor Josh.
Poor Josh.
I'm sorry.
He's the odd one out.
I know, dude.
Odd
so
number.
Can you accommodate me and explain?
How are Josh and Dominic similar?
To present the question, how are 2 and 7 the same, and to simplify it down to just like the answer could be, the obvious answer is just that, oh, they're both numbers, is
strange.
It's strange. That's more strange to me than saying like, oh, they both look the same. Like reading deeper into the question,
right.
Because it's like, if that was going to be the case, if you were just going to say that they're both numbers, you might as well have said what are the similarities between the number 2 and a dog, because they're two totally different things. So then you have to work harder to find the connection in those two things.
The numbers question is too simple.
Yeah.
Right.
The numbers answer is too simple. So he's like, we should have done something more complex.
I totally get it. But I think that's the point, though, right? Is that the person who's neurodivergent is going to read further into it unnecessarily.
Yeah. That's what I'm explaining. I'm explaining that side of it, of like, that's why it's so strange to us.
Yeah, we're not looking at it as a diagnostic tool. We're just looking at it as a question and be like, this is a stupid question or silly question, like a silly way of thinking. The way that we think about it is more complex, and we would have to find the connections the way that would be harder to do if it was a harder question.
We get it.
So this was my So this was my Saturday like 3 weeks ago.
That's why I also don't like the whole thing about like you're comparing apples to oranges. I'm like, they're both fruit. They are similar.
Well, actually, oranges grow from a vine, apples grow from a flower.
But that's the same thing, though. The obvious thing is that they're both fruit. If you were like, wait, one has...
But you're saying...
What he just did is like being like they're both slanted.
But here's the thing. Here's the thing about that comparison is that you're saying apples and oranges are totally different things, that you can't compare them. And I'm saying like, no, they're very simple to compare to each other.
You know what this is? Literal thinking.
Literally.
Can we go back to masking really quick? And like older people. So first of all, the way that autism is perceived by older generations is very influenced by the history of it, and how if somebody had a child with any disability, but autism was definitely a big part of that, they were expected to send their child away off to an institution and just to live there and ignore that they ever existed. So if you were from that generation or have memory of that happening, then you see people that are just comfortable with themselves. It's so jarring. It was like, no, this is a bad thing. This is a secret thing.
Yeah. That's like a thing I tell, like I'll have like uncles or just even just older Latinos in general. They'll be like, well, everyone's all autistic now. Like we didn't have autistic kids. And I was like, yeah, because they were gone. They still existed,
Yeah.
Like a lot of these new, it's not a generation choosing to identify. It's a generation that's not afraid to identify. These people have always, not just autism, like all of these different LGBT, like all these categories and communities always existed. They're just not hiding it anymore.
This is a joke for probably 3 people, but I was like, the real kukui is being different.
I like that.
I'm going to laugh and cry.
Did you have a kukui when you were a kid?
No.
Do you know what that is?
No.
So kukui is just like if there's a room or a closet you want to keep the kids out of.
Boogeyman.
The boogeyman.
Yeah.
The monster.
Yeah.
The monster under the bed. Yeah.
The kukui lives in the closet.
I heard the term, but I just was never afraid of anything like that.
Okay, brave.
You sound so badass.
I was afraid.
Look at me. The kukui isn't real.
I feel like Josh was one of those existential kids. Like, you didn't have fantastical fears. You were afraid of like legitimate, like
My parents.
the sense of your parents' divorce. Yeah. Where were we?
I have more to say on masking if you guys.
Oh yeah. That's what
Okay,
we were asking.
so the masking adults thing.
Asking about masking, I got here.
I'm on ADHD medication, by the way, so this is keeping me very in line. But I'm normally this way. What were we talking about?
trying
I'm
to
like,
get
no, I
on
can
it.
focus now. I remember.
Hell
Yeah. It took me a long time. We can get into that too. But the masking thing, the way that adults are like, well, yeah, I did that too. And it's like they thought that they just had to push past it and get over it. And in my experience, there is no scientific basis for what I'm saying. But I've noticed that it's like this generation has autistic traits. This generation has autistic traits that are a little more pronounced. And then this generation is like a child that gets diagnosed at age 3.
Yeah.
So I think it's a combination of masking and not like they're not accommodating for themselves because they're masking, and they don't recognize that they have troubles with things because they're masking it, or they're accommodating themselves in ways that they don't realize are accommodations.
Yeah. It is weird. It leads to some weird conversations, especially like not to turn it this way, but with older, for lack of a better phrasing, older white autistic people, they're very hung up on Asperger. And then even if you explain where that term comes from, it's named after a doctor, they'll be like, yeah, but he wasn't a Nazi. And I was like, okay, he wasn't like in the military, but he worked for them.
Mm-hmm.
Can you explain for the people that don't know?
Oh, yeah. So Asperger's is a term for what would be considered previous, like 20 years ago, sort of elevated form of autism. It focused specifically on social behaviors and communication disorders rather than learning disabilities or any of the other things associated with autism. And if you were diagnosed Asperger, you were considered high functioning. Both of those terms didn't originate, or high functioning didn't originate with this guy, but it's how he introduced how it's applied to autism. Hans Asperger was a scientist, worked for the Nazi Party, even though he wasn't part of the Nazi Party. And he did a study using children from the camps. And that's where the history starts. And officially, there's only 2 reports of this leading to children being considered low functioning. And because of that, they were sent to die.
Yeah. So there's been a movement, right, to remove that diagnosis or like that label, right?
Remove the label, yeah, because technically it's still a recognized term, but it's no longer a recognized distinction from the autism diagnosis. How it is used in DSM-5, from what I can remember, is it is still a distinction about high and low functioning, but it's still autism.
Right. But you were saying this thing about like older white autistics.
Yeah, they'll fight against that history, and they'll fight against like why it's not an accepted term anymore, because they need that distinction. They need to show that they're not like, I guess, quote unquote, one of the bad ones.
They're
that
not
makes
that
sense.
autistic.
Yeah. Yes, that was the phrase I was looking for. They're not that autistic. And yeah, that goes back to what I was saying before about the choice of terminology that people have just developed socially, or it's like there is no this or that autistic. There's levels and support needs, but it's all autism. It's like if somebody has their arm chopped off in the middle versus someone who has it at the elbow, yeah, they have more of their arm, but they're both still missing an arm, if that makes sense.
I think the term is amputee. I don't know if people appreciate that term, but that's a term that I know.
Yeah.
And yeah, in either case, that's
They're
still
considered
true.
They still have no use of that hand because the hand's not there. In the same vein, it's like there's a lot that we are better at coping with, but in my opinion, it's all kind of like a luck of the draw. Like from to our best knowledge, I was nonverbal till 4. There was no way of knowing that I would figure that out. You know, I could have never learned the correlation between it. Mm-hmm. I just happened to. Because of that, using these old formats would be considered higher functioning than someone who's nonverbal. But I've seen people who are nonverbal that learn sign language or can read and write and still communicate. They just can't formulate words because of a misfiring in their synapses.
Mm-hmm. May I think what you're also referring to is non-speaking. That's a common thing. That's
yeah. Non-speaking because they can still communicate. They just can't formulate verbal words.
Spoken words.
Spoken words. Sorry.
Just as a quick note, amputee is still accepted, but person with amputation is the person first way to say it.
Right. I think that's what we're looking for.
Which people also have different feelings about that. Like autistic people, there are some people who prefer person first, and there are some people who prefer identity first, which is where I say autistic person versus person with autism. So I feel like if that's the case, there's probably
back and forth.
I think it's case by case, and it's also depends on like the whatever the disability or condition is. Because I've met people where they talk about. I have a friend that has bipolar disorder, and they were like, I was explaining like the difference, people first versus identity first language. And they were saying how like, well, that's different for autism or ADHD.
Mm-hmm.
There's still a big stigma around bipolar disorder. So it's important to put person first in that case because of the stigma about it.
I say I'm bipolar. But it is a difference. There is a difference.
It's like a difference in thought and whatever people are comfortable with. It's hard to grasp for anything. It's like even just like as the complexities of being Latino and like as self-identifying Latino, Latinx, Chicano, all that.
I like Latine.
I also like it. It's fun to say.
Do you have a favorite word to say? I was just talking about this with my friend.
Constantinople.
That's a good one.
Sassafras.
I like saying Doofenshmirtz, but with a Yiddish accent. Doofenshmirtz.
Oh,
Yiddish.
goodness.
I thought Swedish for a second.
Doofenshmirtz. I don't know. I
don't
can't
know
do
if I have
Swedish.
The word we said, I said a lot during the last podcast we did was phenomenological. I like saying that one.
I was going to ask about that because I went to my friend's graduation and there was somebody that wrote their master's or their doctorate arguing for
phenomenological
research? Can you explain what that is? Because we got into a conversation about it, and I like lit up during.
I remembered what you said about it last year. That's what that was.
I had lit up when it came up in conversation because I was like, oh, I think from what you explaining it, but then as I started to explain it, I was like, I'm not making any sense.
Yeah, I heard you say it in a follow-up podcast episode, by the way.
Oh yeah.
Yeah, if I remember correctly, it was like it was a term you preferred instead of anecdotal.
I don't know. I didn't think about it in this moment. Maybe in that moment I did.
Yeah, what you were
That's what we were
explaining
talking
was
about.
like when personal experience can be valid as evidence towards something.
Basically, yeah. So I used phenomenological research for my senior thesis in college, where I talked about the oh my gosh, I can't think of the word. Like when things are so interwoven and interconnected that they're like the same thing. So it was specifically about the interconnections between the way that women's bodies are considered our identities, and specifically a U.S. case study. I did all the research within documentaries and books, and my research was my own life. So I wrote things like, this is what I was wearing, this is what I said, this is the situation I was in, this is how the person treated me, things like that.
Mm-hmm. So my understanding of it is essentially like when it comes to labels for assortment of things, but like general diagnoses is like you have like a kind of a guide of like these are things to look out for, but it's not necessarily the universal experience. So because my understanding was that anecdotal evidence is often dismissed because it's not a hard study. Mm-hmm. And if somebody doesn't fully line up with what the general acceptance of that diagnosis is, then it might be dismissed. But like it essentially is putting value in like case by case studies and putting value in somebody's individual experience.
Yeah. And the way that somebody experiences a disability, it's going to impact them regardless of whether statistically a lot of people experience this or not.
Right. Well,
This entire time, I keep hearing the word phenomenological, but to the song Phenomena from the Muppets.
I'm having my
Phenomenological.
mind blown about over here. I looked it up.
Can you explain it?
It's a bunch of stuff. Phenomenological refers to a philosophical approach that emphasizes the study of conscious experiences from the first person's perspective. This approach, rooted in the work of Edmund Husserl and later developed by philosophers like Martin Heidegger, Maurice Merleau-Ponty, and Jean-Paul Sartre. Is that how you say that name?
I think it's. I'm not gonna bother.
I have no idea.
I think it's Sartre, like Sartre.
Oh,
Satire?
Oh, I'm sorry, that's offensive. I'm bad at reading. Focuses on how individuals perceive, interpret, and experience phenomena. There's a lot. Do I need to read it all?
No, that was good.
There's like 5 things: first-person perspective, intentionality, epoch and reduction, essences, and lived experiences.
What is epoch?
Husserl introduced the idea of epoche or epoch, I think, or bracketing, which involves suspending judgments about the external world to focus purely on the experience itself. Reduction involves analyzing these experiences to uncover their essential structures.
My connection to this was that it's important to accept phenomenological experiences because you can like prevent somebody from getting the accommodations that they need if they don't line up with the general acceptance.
Yeah, that's actually something. Going back to, you mentioned that you're currently taking ADHD medication. I've been struggling with my. I'm trying to switch doctors, to be honest, because she is trying to be helpful. She's what's the word? Listening but not hearing. Every time I bring up something related to my ADHD processes, and I'm telling her, like, I'm trying to get medication to deal with my anxiety and my ADHD, she's trying to convince me that it's seasonal depression.
Right. It's like, that's not what the book says. Kind of a thing,
and it's
right?
like, or like I'll explain, like, I have issues keeping things in mind. I forget things. And she's like, well, just keep a journal, write it on your calendar. I'm like, you aren't here. Like, I'm almost 30. I've been doing those things.
Yeah.
That's the stereotypical not helpful response.
Yeah.
But it doesn't sound like your practitioner has a bias. And I was with a psychiatrist who very quickly was like, yeah, bipolar and borderline personality disorder. And then I was like, hey, autism and ADHD. And for years, he's just been like, I don't know. Go ask someone else because I'm not sure.
I'm trying to find somewhere else to go. Because, and it was out the gate too. She's helped me so far, but a lot of the stuff seems just slightly out of date. Like she prescribed me Wellbutrin, and they didn't put me on Wellbutrin because a lot of pharmacies aren't carrying it anymore. They put me on what like Wellbutrin became. I don't even remember what it's called. Or it was things like how the conversation in my head started was she asked me my pharmacological is not the word I'm looking for. My
pharmaceutical?
Yeah, my history with medication, what I used to take, what it was for, how much I was given. And I brought up being given a stimulant for ADHD. And I was only answering her question. She asked me what pills I took. I brought up this pill. But as soon as she heard me say that, she goes like this. A lot of people are coming in. A lot of younger people come in that they're on TikTok and they think that they have autism and ADHD. And I stopped her and I was like, no, I'm just telling you the pill I was given. I've been diagnosed with ADHD. It's in the forms on your desk. And we kept talking about it, and I didn't feel like she was hearing me. We moved on in the conversation, and then she starts reading the paper, and she goes, oh, I see here you have been diagnosed with ADHD. And I was like, yeah, I said that an hour and a half ago.
Yeah.
So she's like who I have to deal with right now, but I am trying to switch doctors because I'm specifically trying to address the issues that I can't control without assistance.
Right. It's so hard when you have to go through like someone else to get.
It's been like yesterday was a good example. I think I texted you guys when it happened. My dad's kitchen almost flooded, and they had just left, so I had to deal with it. And it's a thing where I work on my ability to problem solve quickly, but it's a thing that I have a learning disability with. Like, I have a delay because I need context to understand the decision I'm making. So if I don't have context, I get overwhelmed, and then things get worse before I can fix them. Mm-hmm. And that almost happened in this instance. The short of it is there was a clog in the sink, and the sink pipes are connected to our washing machine. And so when the washer was on, it overflowed the sink, and then it started to pour out onto the floor. And it took me a second while my brother's like shuffling water out of the sink to think of what to do. So the first thing I did was unplug the washing machine. That didn't do anything, and I realized the clog had forced a vacuum, like when you siphon gas out of a car with a hose. So it was pulling water from the pressure valve. So I had to turn off the pressure valve. Once I did that, everything just went down and we were fine. We cleaned it up in like 20 minutes. Which was a good moment for me. And I feel like with someone, like if my dad was there, that's what he would have done. I didn't remember that washing machines had pressure valves. I needed that context. And if I hadn't remembered, it would have gotten worse before I could fix it. And it's a thing that I've come to acknowledge, like, I want to be a functioning member of society, but I am disabled. I have a learning disability. And even though to some people, speak eloquently, like people have called me self-aware when I explain things, and I was like, yeah, because I had to learn about it. Knowing about it doesn't always make it go away. Like, it's still a thing that it's a misfiring in my brain.
A lot of what you were saying is similar to my experience. I have a psychiatrist, and I let him know all these things, and I've been seeing this person for years, and they've constantly sent me other providers that they think would go through the assessment process with me. And none of them have. Most of them don't want to work with adults at all. And that had been going on for years, to the point where I just switched to a different psychiatrist. And they asked me the one sheet of paper, do you fit the criteria for ADHD? And I do. And then he was like, okay, here, try this medication. And it's been amazing. Mm-hmm. And it has helped with my anxiety. And I didn't expect that because I was already on anti-anxiety medication. But the ADHD medication has eased the anxiety kind of like from the inside is how I perceive it.
Yeah, that's something that I've experienced even without medication. When I've learned to cope with my process, like my literal processing, what's the term? Sequence, I guess, is the best I can think of right now. It's brought down my anxiety. I had severe anxieties right after high school, like first in my job. I used to have panic attacks when we worked together. I had to and this was at a time when when I first started working with Dominic, I started in the clean room, but very shortly was moved to my own station, and I had to run a whole machine by myself. And I didn't realize until a month in that I was the one that had to learn about this machine. I was expecting to be taught about it. It was a brand new machine that they'd never used before. So if I didn't know, nobody knew. And that became a thing that was overwhelming for me. And later on, we had someone else take over that station, and I moved. But when he took it on, they alternated. He had a backup so he could take breaks. And then I was also considered a backup, but I was just in a different station. They also used tools. They updated the machine. They added parts that inadvertently made the overall process a lot smoother. And they also adjusted how they dealt with like misfires with this machine. And all of that stuff, not to say like that's what I needed, but like it was a learning thing for all of us. I just happened to be the one at the forefront. I forget where I started with that because I'm trying to bring it back
Sequencing ADHD.
We're talking about medications affects your...
So even without medication, when I learned to slow down and assess things and absorb context and ask for context and like be assertive about when I needed room, my anxiety went down. I haven't had like a panic attack. Well, I had one a couple of years ago when they put me on Wellbutrin. I don't know if it's related, but I stopped taking it and I'm fine. But before a month ago, I haven't had a panic attack since I was 21. So that's 8 years. And yeah, it was a huge thing where it's like, it wasn't just my general anxiety. It was also that I was overwhelmed with decision. I was overwhelmed with like not knowing how to decide things.
Yes.
Okay, so we're reaching to where we normally end our episodes, but I feel like we're finally getting really cooking going. And there's some questions that I have for Dani that I would like for us to expand on. So we're going to do a part 2 to this episode. But for this week, Dani, thanks so much for coming out here and being part of this conversation. It's been I always love listening to you guys talk about these things. It's very enlightening for me. So we're gonna keep going. Expect a part 2 to this episode. It's coming.
Spanish Inquisition.
But for right now, is there anyone that's listening or watching that from last year's episode has learned anything about themselves and has connected or related to any diagnoses? Let us know in the comments. Thank you everybody for being here this week. From us at Un Poquito.
Don't fly.